this is another one of those conversations where you want to ask, is your school committee talking about this? So Joe asked me a question kind of on the side. Isn't the State Department of Education already demanding a bunch of this data? And the answer is sure, we got a data warehouse. But having a data warehouse, remember Race to the Top was an expensive way to get a data warehouse, but we got one. But what NSBA is saying, what the folks who contributed to this document are saying, is it's not enough to have data someplace. The question is, are we telling people what the data is, and are we using it to drive policy decisions, to do problem solving? The fact that it sits in a virtual warehouse someplace doesn't get the job done. And so, is there an annual report that your school committee publishes about student achievement and other indicators of what a successful district looks like? And if you publish that, that would suggest that you've actually had a conversation about what data should we collect other than what the State Department of Education demands of us. Because there may well be things that are really important to the school committee. RIDE doesn't have a clue about it. Really, because they're not a school committee. They're not responsive to your community. And so you have to have a conversation about what data will we collect other than student achievement data that goes into RIDE. And then, how are we using that? So when a policy question comes, when a problem comes, part of that conversation is, well, what do we know? And what questions do we have and we don't have answers? If you don't go through that process of using data, then you have not achieved accountability. Accountability is about generating data and then making use of it. And part of this process, I want to identify two other elements here. It's important that you produce essentially your own report card. So how are students doing? How is the district doing? How is the school committee doing? But producing that report card without giving reference points, how are we doing on what standard? So if you are publishing a report about your community and you're not mentioning any other community, the average reader is going to have no idea whether this is good or bad. So have you picked reference districts? Districts that look like you, so that you can identify not only how are your students doing, because for some districts that answer is going to be really good, but how much have we moved? Because sometimes the answer to how are our students doing is really positive. The answer may still be, have we improved? No, we are flatlining. Flatlining is another way of saying there is no electrical discharge happening in the brain. And so if we're not moving on an upward slant, then we may be doing well, but all we are is racing toward mediocrity. So the question is, have you picked reference districts? And then I would offer a challenge. Because it's really important to know, given comparable districts, are you doing better? Are you improving faster? But then pick the best districts in the state.
Well, how about the honesty?
I'm okay with that. It's easier to gather comparable data within the state. And so if you go look at Massachusetts, Massachusetts, clearly #1 in the country. The problem is that their indicators don't match up necessarily with our indicators. So you have to do you're going to end up, somebody's going to challenge you, well, they're not measuring the same thing. And we have really good districts in the state, You just have to, I'll leave it to you to decide which ones those are, and then are you comfortable with the comparison? Because it is not an excuse to be a district that doesn't have resources and say, well, so that our kids aren't going to do really well. And there are districts around the country that have nothing, that are doing really well in terms of student achievement. And there are districts around the country that have all the resources you could ever ask for, and the outcomes are not good. And you need to decide where you are. So you pick reference districts, and then one of the really positive things that came out of Race to the Top in Rhode Island is that it disaggregated the data. So you couldn't say, oh, our attendance data is great. 95% of the kids show up every day. That sounds like we're doing really well. But it might be saying only 5% of our kids never come to school. And are you comfortable with 5% of your kids never entering the door? So you need to disaggregate the data, and you ought to be asking yourself the question, if we're doing okay generally, that's an indicator of average, what's in the fancy language of researchers, a measure of central tendency. What is it that characterizes the students who are doing best? What are the characteristics of those students? And maybe much more importantly, who isn't doing so well? Can we identify where the achievement is less than we would expect or hope for? Remember that vision statement. Does it talk about every child, or does it talk about kids are going to do okay here? If it's every child, then you have to go look at gaps in outcomes. And I would make the argument that this accountability standard speaks to, if you have a population of children who are not achieving well, it's important to identify it, but if you have no plan, all you've had is an interesting research project. You come to Rhode Island College, which is where I teach, I'll be glad to give you a good grade on research. But if you're not doing something about it, you're failing in your job, which is to make sure that the kids do well. And so what's the plan for each group that is underperforming? What's the plan, and does it align with resources? If you haven't resourced the plan, then you are engaging in wishful thinking. You are engaging in a process of thought that says, if we develop a plan, that's all you need to do, it's going to be great, and magically things will happen. So it is identify the gaps in outcome, figure out a plan for intervention, resource that plan, and measure like hell. And that's the advantage of continuing to collect data. This is not, there is in the world of attention and accountability, there is formative evaluation and summative evaluation. Summative evaluation is when you collect data and the data is informative, but it's too late to do any good for the kids who we collect the data on because it's after the experience. Formative data, let's get the data in as they're going through the process so we can make mid-course corrections. So you need to think about, how is your school committee functioning with regard to accountability? Are you focused on who's making it and who's not? Does your school committee have a plan for eliminating student achievement gaps? And if I looked at your budget, could I tell that you actually gave a damn about the plan? Can I find the money that's going to make the difference? If not, you're going to come up short. You're going to have identified a group, you will have talked about what we ought to do, and a year later or 6 months later, you're going to be looking at the same data and the same group. And frankly, the achievement gap has been identified by the State Department of Education as not a problem identified in some communities. It is a problem in every community. This is not the urban core communities. This is not communities that are rural. Every one of us has achievement gaps in our data, if you have the courage to go look at it. Now, the good news is, for all of those of you who are school committee members, you don't have to look at it, because you have somebody who works for you. Tell the superintendent to go look at it and come back with the data. You don't have to be specialists in data analysis. Tell the superintendent to come back, give us the answer in English, and let's have a conversation about where we go next. The expectation of data analysis is legitimately on the superintendent, and then it's your job to work really hard to try to understand what do we have, and again, vision. Where are we going? Not how are we getting there. That's the professional's job. But where are we going? What's the plan? So I'm going to ask you to do one more self-assessment on page 36. So go through this for your own school committee. And then again, talk at your table about where you are in terms of policy, because the leverage point you all have to make a difference is the policy that you pass. The power of school committees is to ask questions and to make policy-level decisions, and then we turn it over to the paid staff. So go through this, look at your own school committee, and then talk a little bit about what you're seeing.